we're trying to figure out what the word lahachalitz means.
Yes. So basically there it comes from a meaning that means to remove, okay, to set free perhaps in a way. Let me go to Jastro and see what he has to say. Give me a moment and I will. Okay, here we go. Just let me open that up and look up the word chalatz. There it is. All right. To take off, to undress is one word. I'm going to go to the previous page and see what it says there. Okay. It can also mean to surround, to fortify, to gird, to arm in biblical Hebrew.
So
yeah, go ahead.
And I have a Google took me to Strong's when I looked up chalatz, and it says like withdraw, draw off, or draw out.
Well, that would make sense in terms of people who go and rescue people from buildings and things. Yeah, a second meaning is to untie, to loosen, to tear out, to strip, to lay bare. And
in the Shabbat.
Well, that could mean to gird us, to fortify us. That's the first meaning he gives.
Okay. Fortify.
Aramaic despoil.
Yes.
Which is also taking something.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Right. To remove. I would say fortify would be the right way to translate that.
Well, yeah, here I see where it says equipped for war, armed for war.
Yeah, chalutzim. We have that word, right?
Yeah, the pioneers.
Right. It's
the fighters. Yeah, I don't know if they were
girded or armed. Okay. Strange though, because the two meanings seem sort of opposite.
Or it could have meant that they were withdrawn from exile into Haaretz. So
maybe.
What are you referring to?
Chalutzim. In 1917.
Yeah, let me just quickly double check what it says as the examples. Yeah, that is interesting.
It's even in Zoom Gali.
Yeah.
It is.
Oh wow, you remember the words to that? Wow.
Well, just
of course.
All of them.
There's not that many. It's like Echalutz.
Yeah.
Laman avodah. Avodah laman echalutz.
Yes, boy. Shirei Sochnut. Okay, let's go back.
Music.
To our text. All right, I'm going to go back to the screen share. And here we go. All right, and we said that the reason they can't do that is because they have to be dedicated to God. V'kidashto, okay, and you will sanctify him, ki et lechem elokecha hu makriv, because, as I said, the food, I think we did translate this, right, of your God, he presents, kadosh yelach, he shall be sanctified to you, ki kadosh ani, for I am sacred, I am sanctified, I the Lord, I the Lord who sanctifies you. So there's this whole sense when we talk about this word sanctify to mean to make special. That's the best way I can explain to sanctify. And then it has also that meaning of being separated off, unique, sui generis, that kind of thing. So here we go. We had mentioned this. V'kidashto, you shall sanctify him. Al korcho means against his will. And in what sense will you sanctify him against his will? She'im lo ratzal legaresh, that if he does not wish to divorce, halkehu v'yasrehu, literally it means to beat him, smack him, and make him hurt, make him punish him. ad sheyigaresh, until he, in fact, divorces. This is, there's not a lot of shading, at least in this particular sense. But when you are a Kohen, you have a very, very privileged position, and that means you have, ultra responsibilities. Kadosh yelacha, he shall be sacred to you. Nahog bo kedusha, act in a holy way towards him. In other words, attribute holiness to him. In what sense? Liftoach rishon b'chol davar. This is a perk he has. He opens first in every matter. And that's why the Kohen gets the first aliyah, or probably is invited to lead Birkat HaMazon. That is something that the Kohen, that's one of the ways in which we grant sanctity to the Kohen. Ulavarech, there we go, Ulavarech Rishon B'Seudah, and to also bless first at a meal. So he's given that privilege as well. But any way in which you can give the priest first dibs, that's a perk that a priest gets, by way of us showing that we're treating him in a sacred way, as someone holy. And this is, now we're on to the famous verse 9, okay? So hold on to your horses.
And I guess, if there's not a Kohen to start the benching, then a Levi would be second in command, like in the Aliyot, or no?
Well, you don't have to give. My understanding is that you do not have to give a Levi the first Aliyah if there's no Kohen present. It's not quite the same. But the Levi, it's not the same kind of entitlement. It's just a way of creating a situation where there's some pecking order. But I could be wrong, but I don't believe you have to give the Levi the Aliyah. It's just that if it's a nice thing to do, because Levis cannot take subsequent Aliyahs. Unless there are no other people there except Levis, I suppose, right? So, yeah. Okay, let's go plunge into this verse. Uvat ish kohen, and the daughter of a man who is a kohen. Ki techel liznot, if she begins to act lewdly, okay, to act as a prostitute. But we'll see, that's a very tough translation of it, because liznot has more to do with meaning to go astray, I think would be perhaps a better translation. But
it talks about adultery.
Yeah, right. Well, Rashi's going to define what that means. I mean, it becomes important for the tradition not to have some sort of vague meaning of this, because the punishment is so severe. Et aviha hi mechalelet. She is profaning her father. Interesting statement, by the way. I think a positive takeaway for us is to realize that we never really behave just for ourselves, that our family is directly impacted by the choices we make. And, there's definitely, I think, an attitude out there that says, well, I'm the one who's making these decisions. If I want to behave this way, that's okay. But you don't take into account the fact that your family is directly impacted by those decisions, and that our lives are really bound up with one another far more significantly than I think we're always willing to admit. At any rate, that's coming from that. Ba'esh tisaref, she shall be burned in fire. So before I go into the Rashi, let me explain that capital punishment was an alternative according to traditional law. I will tell you that every attempt was made in the judicial process to not have a situation where somebody was executed. But that's a whole other subject, which we can go into. But they did accept in principle the idea of capital punishment. And there were 4 types of capital punishment. They all were supposed to be instantaneous. They were not supposed to, it was death that was sought and not suffering. So, for example, as horrible and awful as this is, and it's worse than it really sounds in some ways, they made sure, this is mentioned in of course, in Sanhedrin and in various sources, that essentially they would strangle the person first before they would start any of these kinds of punishments, so that a person was unconscious when this was happening. But it is pretty awful, because essentially what they would do is they would wrap a scarf around the person's neck, and 2 people would then pull on it. That would basically render the person unconscious. He would open his mouth, and if I'm not mistaken, they would pour like hot lead, something like that, down that person's mouth. That's what we're talking about. That's burning. So it's pretty awful when you think about it. But it was, in a way, trying to warn people. How effective that is. I'm not a psychologist or a social psychologist, but I would say that it would scare people pretty much if they saw this kind of stuff was going on.
Rabbi, as far as the hot lead, I mean, and I might have been off base, but when it said burning by fire,
yes.
First I'm thinking, well, what other kind of burning is there? Why would they say fire? But then I think, well, they could have been burned by coal or something else. But the fact that they said burning by fire seems like it's not hot lead.
Yeah, no, I don't believe anybody was actually tied to the stake and put on a bonfire. It had to be instantaneous. The death itself would be instantaneous. So we can, see how they derive that out. If you think about how Aaron and his son, Aaron's sons perished, I think there was also in the story of Korach, it talks about the people who brought the incense, and it talks how they also their bodies were left intact. It did not destroy their bodies. It destroyed them internally. Yeah.
Rabbi, does it say that the person is killed, or could it just be a nasty burn on the face to marking?
No, it's a capital punishment.
Okay.
That's clearly understood in this context. And you're right, from this alone, we might not be able to derive that. But the fact is that, as I said, there were 4 types of punishments for specific types of sins. Probably the lightest was strangulation, which went as the way I explained it. It was done with a scarf. Okay. You weren't hanged from the neck until dead. It didn't go like that. They did it this way. Partly the reason to say that the people who are responsible for that judgment have to actually carry it out. This is all a way of in general preventing this from happening at all. There was decapitation, and there was stoning, which again wasn't people pelting someone with stones. Essentially, if you're okay about my describing these things, they basically, as I said, they would render the person unconscious. They would throw them over the edge of a cliff that was deep, into a pit or into someplace that was lower down, sufficiently lower down, so that the moment they hit the bottom, they would basically be totally unconscious. They would take a large stone and they would drop it on the person. Again, the horrific nature of these things, I think, were supposed to make people wake up and say, wait a second, if those are the consequences, I don't want to mess with this. I've said this before, right? That part of what gets people into terrible, terrible trouble is they tend to trivialize what they're doing. And there's this little voice inside of people that say, well, everybody does it, or it's not really so bad, or, and tends to trivialize these acts. And that's why people do them.
What's number 4?
Okay, so that would be the burning, right?
Burning,
Yeah.
stoning, decapitating.
Strangulation.
Strangulation.
Yes.
Are these also have to be witnessed and warned?
Yes, absolutely. Those were part.
So,
Let me stop
yeah.
the share now. I'm going to stop.
So
the
it's really, really rare.
Yes,
Super rare.
in fact, if a bit, and it had to be done by a bit din of no less than 23 judges.
Wow.
You had to have 20.
And
yeah.
Didn't they used to say that if there was a court that killed 2 people in 70 years or something, it was a bloody court?
Yeah, a murderous bit din.
So, as far as to try to prevent that, if somebody was sort of guilty, for instance, of adultery, a woman, for instance, could some kind of defense be made that there was some horrible treatment from her husband that, lessened, diminished her culpability through, her being in a reactive, harder state of mind, or that kind of thing existing, or
So you're asking me a question that is outside my wheelhouse. Exactly the nature. The only kinds of defenses that I'm actually familiar with is that they would question. There were different kinds of evidence that witnesses had to be able to provide, and you had to have a minimum of 2 witnesses who would be warned very severely before they gave testimony. They couldn't hear each other's testimony, because one of the ways in which you could show that the person could not be executed is if there's inconsistencies in the testimony of the witnesses. So they get at least 2, and if possible, as many witnesses as they could. And by the way, circumstantial evidence was not admissible. That you could not convict on circumstantial evidence. So, but again,
be related to
general. Sorry, go ahead.
The witnesses couldn't be related to one another.
Correct. They couldn't be related to one another. They couldn't be related to the person they were testifying against. If they were inveterate gamblers, they were not accepted. You know that women essentially were not accepted as witnesses. This is all ways of minimizing, if you think about it. However, I can tell you that women were accepted as witnesses in a case of if a woman saw that this person's husband had died, okay, like in another country or something like that, her testimony would be accepted to allow the woman to remarry so that she would not be, an aguna. So they did what they could to do that. But, again, sort of rushing to judgment in terms of how women are treated on this basis without knowing the whole picture and all the circumstances, I think that's not the way to go. One has to understand everything that was involved. And I'm not saying you might not wind up with the same opinion, but at least you're now making the judgment based on evidence. But they were very, very strict court cases. By the way, if the entire court, if all 23 judges agreed that this person was guilty, the person was excused because the assumption was that he or she had not received a sufficiently vigorous defense. And of course, they would vote for whether or not to convict. But like I said, if it was unanimous, the assumption was then that the person hadn't received a sufficient defense. And even if they were taken out on their way to the execution ground, if they were said to the people who were accompanying them, oh, I can think of something that would mitigate this, that would turn this overturn this verdict. They were taken back to the court, and the court would convene again, and they would examine the evidence that this person was trying to present. As I said, there were many, many safeguards in terms of, I think there's even a rabbi who said that if I had been on that particular court, they never would have ever convicted anybody, because they would have found questions that would have probably guaranteed that the witnesses would not, that the testimony wouldn't be consistent, or that they wouldn't be able to sufficiently answer the questions. So it is a whole other subject.
Capital punishment was theoretically justified, but practically speaking, almost very rarely.
Right.
In any particular case, it was very rarely justified.
It was avoided wherever possible. We all know that the trouble is, we know for a fact that there are innocent people who have been executed, and you just never want that. There's never an excuse for that. I mean, that's tantamount to murder, legalized murder. So I'm gonna stop the recording and